Hello, everyone. I'm Ethan Masukal, here with the Cipher Brief. Today, we are talking about TikTok and the long running discussion and debate over whether it should be banned as long as it continues to be owned by a Chinese company. Joining me today is Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, the former executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And we're proud to also call him a Cipher Brief expert and a Cyber Initiatives Group principal. He has argued on our site and elsewhere that the ban is both appropriate and necessary. Mark, thanks as always for joining us. Could you start by explaining why, in your view, there is a risk to U.S. national security here?
Sure. Thanks. Today we have about 170 million plus Americans, that use TikTok, and like other social apps, social media apps, TikTok collects a significant amount of personal data on the users. Like others, it has a proprietary algorithm that analyzes and assesses and which each user should see on the app. But unlike other social media apps, TikTok is absolutely works at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party has passed 7 laws between 2015 and 2023 that govern intelligence collection, the proper attitude of companies within China towards the intelligence services, and what the data sharing requirements are, to such a degree that there is no reason to believe contrary than that the Chinese Communist Party will have access to the personal data of the people who of the TikTok consumers, the 170 million Americans in that case. Congress recognized that this is alone is a national security threat. What they said wasn't that TikTok's banned, but they said that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese government control over TikTok affords the Chinese direct access to the 170 million American user accounts, and it's allowed TikTok to manipulate the national security narrative. And I'll talk about what that means in a second, but I just want to finish by saying, they didn't ban it. They said it has to be sold, TikTok does, by ByteDance, the Chinese company, to a company or group of people not under the control of a country of concern like China. And to be a country of concern, you got to really work hard. You got to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Venezuela. I mean, it's a pretty elite group there. I do want to mention one other thing. There is this issue of data, and there is an issue of the manipulation of the algorithm to drive a national security narrative. Mm-hmm. And this is the second big issue, data and national security narrative. In the national security narrative, what I mean by that is TikTok is able to influence what the 170 million Americans really receive. And to be clear, for Americans under 40, these social media apps are their primary source of news and opinion information. And when TikTok was transparent and you could see how the algorithm, the results it produced, it demonstrated a strong anti-United States national security interest narrative, and certainly a strong pro-China one. And just a couple examples are, if you looked at, free, Uyghur genocide, it was 11 times more likely to be available to an Instagram user than an equal number of TikTok users. If you looked at free Tibet, it was 40 times more likely. If you looked at, Taiwan independence, it was 16 times more likely. All these different things were clearly the algorithm was set so that things that China was embarrassed by or didn't like weren't available, or things they didn't agree with weren't available to the American public. And then I'll say that extended even further to include U.S. specific issues like, did support for Ukraine or support for Russia 8 times more likely on support for Ukraine, 8 times more likely on Instagram than on a TikTok, and then the same with Israel and Hamas. So what I'd say is it's the data manipulation, it's the data retention, plus the narrative manipulation that combined present a national security interest that the United States does not have to absorb and should not absorb.
You broke this down really well into the two main issues. Going to the data point really quickly, Can you go into some of the specific reasons why it's a threat for the Chinese government to, as you've described, have a stranglehold on all of this user data?
Access to this data allows them to begin to understand, um, what the likes, dislikes, um, foibles, vulnerabilities of these citizens are. It makes them more susceptible to exploitation. It makes them more susceptible to manipulation. And so, China's access to this data, we in general don't like any foreign country to have access to data like this. And so, but I'd say the number one security aspect of it is the likelihood that this data could be used for exploitation. And this is the same reason we were so offended by the theft of the 24 million OPM records. It's not that it's that valuable for the Chinese to know where I lived in 2013, what was this street address in Yokosuka, Japan. But what matters is that they are able to, in my answers to other questions, how I present myself, it can show both vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So, this data, from my perspective, the national security, there's a financial security perspective to it and other things. I'm not worried about that. This is uniquely the national security perspective.
Going back to what you said in March when the House was voting on this legislation, you described the issue of TikTok being about national security and not a First Amendment issue, and I think that goes to the more of the second problem that you highlighted. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, what I mean by this is that, well, first of all, let's be clear. I think it's been held that a foreign entity, either business or person, doesn't have First Amendment rights in the United States. So this is a claim being made by, and TikTok tries to get around that by saying, well, we're stowing some stuff. They call it the Texas Project, in Texas, and of course that doesn't change your entity's being. And in addition to that, the FBI is the government has reasonably made the argument that the Texas Project does not actually protect U.S. information. But I just want to set aside that, I'm not even sure we should be having this First Amendment discussion in regards. That's the existence of TikTok. Again, I'm not opposed to TikTok. I don't believe the Congress was opposed to TikTok. What they were opposed to was ownership of TikTok by a country of concern. That's when you lose that. So, but to me, the national security issue, the biggest national security issue, surrounds the manipulation of the narrative on the platform to project a anti-American, pro-Chinese national security narrative. And I just have to say, the fact that we're having this discussion is jaw-dropping to me. In 1970, if Pravda tried to purchase CBS News, if the Soviet government tried to purchase CBS News and said, "Don't worry, this is a First Amendment issue. Let Pravda transmit," we would not allow it. Now, look, we've passed laws. There's actual laws, though, that actually explicitly get that and say you can't have foreign ownership of TV, radio, and print media. I mean, that's why Rupert Murdoch's a U.S. citizen, right? I just want to say what's happened here is you have to believe that social media is not a news platform or is not a news propagation service, to not believe that they shouldn't be treated the same as radio, as print, radio, and TV. I used to listen to Russian radio Sputnik driving in the morning here in DC. I can't anymore because it's been banned, right? I mean, there is a reason we don't allow foreign governments to propagate their disinformation directly into our homes. No country in the world allows that to happen, by the way. But somehow in our, because there's greedy money involved, there's greedy people with money involved. And that's all that's going on here. If TikTok was worth 50 cents, then we wouldn't be having a discussion. TikTok is probably worth $200+ billion. And the people who made in much, much smaller investments, pennies on the dollar, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, want to get their money. And they're scared that this law, that ByteDance might prove that the Chinese Communist Party so controls this business that they won't sell it.
Yeah.
And this is the problem if you're one of these rich American investors. And I have zero empathy for the venture capital people who pump their dollars into TikTok. If they didn't know in 2017, 2018, 2019, that pumping their money into a Chinese social media app had a risk of investment, then they're bad investors. And if it turns out this rubs out for them wrong, my answer is that's the life of a venture capitalist. Hopefully your next one makes money. But the idea, I'm sorry I'm going off on a riff here, but I'm so tired of hearing this woe is me about why can't the Chinese government tell their story in America? The answer is they can. They need to label it the Chinese government. They can put press releases out from their embassy. Their ambassador is free to go around America spouting lies. He does. What they can't do is take over a U.S. U.S. social media app and propagate a narrative of the news of international stories that works against the United States. I don't give a damn about dance videos or cat videos. What I care about is the pushing of a narrative that says inside America, Russia is good, Ukraine is bad, the Uyghurs are treated well, there is no genocide, the Tibetans are thrilled, there is no occupation, Taiwan should be part of China, there should be no independence. That is what you hear on TikTok. And the Soviet Union would have loved to have done the same thing in the 1970s, but we stopped them. But there was no money involved there, right? So now that there's American venture capitalist money involved, they're manipulating the system in the argument. They're trying to manipulate the president-elect to have a different end. They're going to lose because the argument I just made, in the end, Congress and the current president are the ones who determine the national security of the United States. They passed a law based on that. I think the judicial is going to, the third leg of the government is going to bend the knee to their, as they traditionally have, to Congress's right to drive the national security narrative in the United States.
And for just a final point, and you mentioned the Texas project, but with this issue over foreign ownership control, is there basically any hope for TikTok? Is there any solution that you think they can take?
So if TikTok is legitimately if ByteDance is legitimately an independent company that can make its own decisions to cash out $200 to $300 billion, like every other place in the world except China, maybe Iran, maybe Russia, but if ByteDance is able to be a smart company and sell, then TikTok's going to live. So yes, there's a future for TikTok. Now, if you're telling me that it turns out ByteDance is so under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party that they will not be allowed to sell in a moment of Chairman Xi's hubris and ego, it kind of proves my point. So I sleep well because either it's sold and TikTok's still around and 18-year-olds can do stupid dance videos to their heart's content, and the news narrative is now just, and then its algorithm is turned to selling that same 18-year-old as many different, blushes and lipstick as they can. Great. But if it turns out that they're not allowed to sell, then my deepest concern was true. That the control was so explicit that they would sacrifice $200 to $300 billion. And by the way, that'll finally be the message. Losing the opportunity to make $200 to $300 billion bucks, I'll bet that'll have an impact, and I'll be thrilled about that. I'll sleep well, January 19th when we get a ruling.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mark Montgomery. Appreciate your insights and appreciate you joining us here at the Cipher Brief.
Thank you.